Maria Santos had always been different from other women in her small mountain village. While others tended gardens and raised children, she studied maps and learned about weapons from her father, a former military officer. At 28, she worked as a local guide for travelers crossing the dangerous mountain passes between countries. Her knowledge of hidden trails and secret routes made her invaluable to anyone needing safe passage through the treacherous terrain. The war had been raging for 3 years, and their peaceful village found itself caught between two opposing armies. Government forces controlled the main roads while rebel groups held the mountain strongholds. Maria tried to stay neutral, helping anyone who paid her fair wages regardless of which side they supported. She believed that survival mattered more than politics. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, Maria received an unusual request. A government captain named Rodriguez approached her with an urgent mission. His unit had received intelligence about a secret rebel camp hidden deep in the mountains. The rebels were reportedly holding several captured government soldiers and planning a major attack on the village. Rodriguez needed someone who knew the mountain paths to guide his squad to the location. Maria hesitated at first. She had never taken sides in the conflict, and guiding soldiers into battle felt different from her usual work. However, Rodriguez explained that innocent villagers would be in danger if the rebels carried out their planned attack. He also mentioned that the captured soldiers included young men from nearby villages, some barely 18 years old. After thinking carefully, Maria agreed to help. She packed her essential gear, including rope, first aid supplies, and emergency food. Rodriguez briefed her on the mission details and introduced her to his squad of 12 experienced soldiers. They would travel light and fast, hoping to reach the rebel camp before dawn and rescue the prisoners. The group set out before midnight, moving quietly through familiar trails that Maria had walked countless times. She led them through narrow passes and around dangerous cliffs, always staying alert for signs of rebel scouts. The soldiers followed her lead, trusting her expertise completely. None of them suspected that this rescue mission would turn into something far more dangerous and unexpected. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Maria noticed fresh footprints in broken branches that suggested recent activity. The rebels were definitely in the area, and they seemed to be moving in larger numbers than Rodriguez had expected. She warned the captain about her observations, but he insisted they continue with the original plan. The night grew colder as they approached the suspected location of the rebel camp. Maria could hear distant voices and see faint lights flickering through the trees ahead. She signaled for the squad to stop and take cover while she scouted the area more carefully. What she discovered would change everything about their mission and put all their lives in immediate danger. Moving carefully through the dense forest, Maria crept closer to the rebel encampment. What she saw made her blood run cold. The camp was much larger than anyone had expected, with at least 50 armed rebels instead of the small group Rodriguez had described. Wooden cages held more than a dozen prisoners, and armed guards patrolled constantly around the perimeter. When she returned to report her findings, Captain Rodriguez made a decision that shocked everyone. Despite being heavily outnumbered, he ordered his men to attack immediately. Maria tried to convince him to retreat and call for reinforcements, explaining that a direct assault would be suicide. Rodriguez refused to listen, claiming that surprise would give them the advantage they needed. The attack began just before dawn. Rodriguez's soldiers opened fire from their hidden positions, hoping to create confusion and reach the prisoner cages quickly. However, the rebels were better prepared than expected. Within minutes, the government squad found themselves surrounded and outgunned. Maria watched in horror as several soldiers fell under heavy enemy fire. Realizing the mission had failed completely, Maria made a desperate choice. Instead of fleeing to safety, she deliberately ran toward the rebel positions with her hands raised high. The surprised rebels captured her easily, assuming she was another government soldier trying to surrender. They dragged her into the camp and threw her into one of the wooden cages with the other prisoners. The remaining government soldiers, including Captain Rodriguez, were forced to retreat down the mountain. They had lost 4 men and failed to rescue anyone. Worse still, they now had to report that their trusted guide had been captured by the enemy. Rodriguez felt guilty about leaving Maria behind, but he had no choice except to save his remaining troops. Inside the prisoner cage, Maria found herself surrounded by captured soldiers. local villagers, and even some women and children. The conditions were terrible, with little food or water and no protection from the cold mountain weather. The rebels used the prisoners as forced labor during the day and locked them in cages at night. Maria quickly realized that the rebel leader, Commander Vasquez, was planning something much bigger than a simple attack on their village. She overheard conversations about coordinated strikes on multiple government positions and plans to expand rebel control throughout the entire region. The prisoners were being kept as bargaining tools and sources of information about government troop movements. Over the following days, Maria carefully observed the camp routines and guard patterns. She noticed that the rebels were confident and careless, believing their mountain stronghold was completely secure. They never suspected that a village guide could pose any threat to their operation. This overconfidence would prove to be their biggest mistake. While pretending to be just another helpless prisoner, Maria began secretly talking to the other captives. She discovered that several were experienced soldiers who still had fight left in them. Others were local people who knew the mountain area almost as well as she did. Slowly, an idea began forming in her mind about how they might escape their desperate situation. After spending 5 days in captivity, Maria had learned everything she needed to know about the rebel camp's weaknesses. The guards changed shifts at predictable times, and there was a 30-minute window each morning when most rebels gathered for their daily briefing. More importantly, she had identified a steep trail leading down the back of the mountain that the rebels didn't bother to guard, because they considered it too dangerous to use. Maria began carefully sharing her escape plan with trusted prisoners. Sergeant Lopez, a captured government soldier with 15 years of experience, became her most valuable ally. 2 local farmers who knew the mountain terrain agreed to help guide the group to safety. Even some of the women prisoners volunteered to create distractions when the time came. The biggest challenge was acquiring weapons and supplies for their escape. Maria noticed that several guards had grown lazy about securing their rifles when they ate meals or took breaks. She also discovered that the rebels stored extra ammunition and food in a poorly guarded tent near the edge of camp. Everything would depend on perfect timing and complete silence. On the chosen morning, Maria put her plan into action. While most rebels attended their daily meeting, she and Sergeant Lopez quietly overwhelmed 2 guards who had stayed behind to watch the prisoners. They used improvised weapons made from broken cage parts and moved with deadly precision. The guards were neutralized before they could raise any alarm. Working quickly, the escaped prisoners armed themselves with captured weapons and gathered essential supplies. Maria led them toward the dangerous trail she had identified, knowing that speed was more important than safety. Behind them, shouts and gunfire indicated that the rebels had discovered their escape and were organizing pursuit teams. The descent down the treacherous mountain path tested everyone's courage and endurance. Several prisoners were injured by loose rocks and steep drops, but Maria refused to leave anyone behind. She used her knowledge of the terrain to find the safest routes while staying ahead of their pursuers. The rebels followed them but struggled to navigate the difficult trail as quickly as Maria's group. By midday, they had reached a more stable part of the mountain where they could move faster. However, Maria realized that simply escaping wasn't enough. The rebels would continue to threaten innocent villages and capture more prisoners unless someone stopped them permanently. She made another bold decision that surprised everyone in her group. Instead of continuing toward safety, Maria announced that they were going to attack the rebel camp. Sergeant Lopez thought she had lost her mind from the stress of captivity. The other prisoners argued that they should focus on reaching government forces who could mount a proper military response. Maria explained that by the time they reached help and returned, the rebels would have moved to a new location. She pointed out that they now had the advantage of surprise, knowledge of the camp layout, and armed fighters who had nothing left to lose. Most importantly, the rebels would never expect escaped prisoners to turn around and attack them. It was exactly the kind of unexpected move that could succeed where conventional military tactics had failed. After heated discussion, most of the group agreed to follow Maria's leadership. They spent the afternoon preparing for their assault, checking weapons and planning their approach routes. As the sun began to set, they started climbing back up the mountain toward the rebel stronghold that had held them captive. The attack began at sunset when the rebels were least prepared for battle. Maria divided her group into 3 teams, each approaching the camp from different directions. She knew that confusion and panic would be their greatest weapons against the larger rebel force. The plan required precise coordination and incredible bravery from people who had been prisoners just hours earlier. Sergeant Lopez led the first team in a direct assault on the main guard positions. His military training proved invaluable as he directed the former prisoners in tactical movements they had never attempted before. Meanwhile, the local farmers used their knowledge of hidden paths to approach the ammunition storage areas undetected. Maria commanded the third team, focusing on rescuing the prisoners who were still trapped in cages. She knew that every person they freed would either join their fight or create additional chaos that would help their cause. The rebels had grown comfortable with their routines and were completely unprepared for an organized attack from supposedly helpless captives. The initial assault succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Within the first 15 minutes, Maria's teams had captured several key positions and freed most of the remaining prisoners. The rebels, confused and disorganized, struggled to mount an effective counterattack. Many of them fled into the forest rather than face the determined fighters who seemed to appear from every direction. Commander Vasquez, the rebel leader, tried to rally his remaining troops for a final stand. However, he discovered that his ammunition supplies had been captured, and many of his most experienced fighters had already abandoned their positions. The tactical situation had completely reversed, with the former prisoners now controlling the high ground and superior firepower. As the battle continued into the night, Maria's leadership skills proved decisive. She coordinated her teams through hand signals and whispered commands, maintaining pressure on the rebels while protecting her own people from unnecessary casualties. Her knowledge of the terrain allowed her to anticipate rebel movements and counter their desperate attempts to regain control. By midnight, the remaining rebels began surrendering in small groups. They had realized that continued resistance was hopeless against an enemy that knew their positions and fighting techniques better than they did themselves. Commander Vasquez himself was captured while trying to escape through the same dangerous trail that Maria had used earlier. The victory was complete, but Maria knew that their work wasn't finished. The captured rebels needed to be secured and transported to government authorities. More importantly, she had to ensure that the rescued prisoners could safely return to their families and communities. The mountain was still dangerous, and dawn would bring new challenges. Maria organized her expanded group into a disciplined unit capable of the difficult journey back to civilization. The former rebels were disarmed and bound, while the rescued prisoners were armed and assigned guard duties. Everyone understood that they were now part of something larger than a simple escape or rescue mission. As she looked out over the captured camp, Maria reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. She had started as a neutral guide trying to help both sides, been captured as a failed rescuer, and emerged as a military leader who had accomplished what trained soldiers could not achieve. The most difficult part of their journey was still ahead of them. The journey down the mountain with prisoners and captured rebels proved more challenging than the battle itself. Maria had to manage a group of nearly 40 people, including wounded fighters, frightened civilians, and hostile captives who looked for any opportunity to escape or cause trouble. The terrain remained treacherous and everyone was exhausted from the night's fighting. Sergeant Lopez helped maintain discipline among the former prisoners who were now acting as guards. However, tensions ran high between people who had suffered under rebel captivity and their former captors. Maria had to intervene several times to prevent violence that could have compromised their entire mission. She insisted that all prisoners, regardless of their previous actions, would be treated according to proper military standards. The most dangerous moment came when they encountered a rebel patrol that had been searching for survivors from the destroyed camp. The patrol consisted of 8 heavily armed fighters who initially assumed that Maria's group was a government rescue operation. When they realized the truth about what had happened, they attempted a desperate attack to free their captured comrades. Maria quickly positioned her people for defense while trying to minimize casualties on both sides. The brief firefight ended when the rebel patrol leader was wounded, and his remaining fighters agreed to surrender. This brought their total number of prisoners to over 20, creating additional logistical problems for the descent. By afternoon, they had reached the lower mountain slopes where the terrain became easier to navigate. However, Maria faced a new dilemma about how to approach the government forces waiting in the valley below. She worried that nervous soldiers might open fire on their large, mixed group before recognizing that they were friendlies returning with prisoners. Using her knowledge of military protocols, Maria sent Sergeant Lopez ahead with 2 other former prisoners to make contact with the government forces. They carried a white flag and clear identification to prevent any tragic misunderstandings. Maria waited with the main group in a secure position until she received confirmation that it was safe to proceed. The reunion with Captain Rodriguez and his remaining troops was emotional and confusing. Rodriguez had expected to receive news about Maria's death or continued captivity. Instead, he found himself greeting a confident military leader who had accomplished an impossible mission, using unconventional tactics and sheer determination. As they approached the government base camp, word spread quickly about the extraordinary events in the mountains. Soldiers who had given up hope of ever seeing their captured comrades again watched in amazement as the rescued prisoners marched into camp. Even more surprising was the sight of defeated rebels being led as captives by the same woman who had disappeared during the failed rescue mission. General Martinez, the regional military commander, arrived to personally debrief Maria about her experiences and methods. He was particularly interested in her tactical innovations and leadership techniques that had succeeded where conventional military operations had failed. The general recognized that Maria's actions had implications far beyond a single rescue mission. The captured rebels, including Commander Vasquez, provided valuable intelligence about rebel operations throughout the region. Under interrogation, they revealed the locations of other camps, supply routes, and planned attacks that government forces could now prevent or counter. Maria's successful mission had disrupted rebel activities across an entire mountain district. However, Maria herself seemed uncomfortable with the attention and praise being directed toward her. She insisted that the real heroes were the prisoners who had risked everything to fight for their freedom, and the soldiers who had followed her into battle against overwhelming odds. Her humility only increased the respect that others felt for her remarkable achievement. News of Maria's incredible achievement spread throughout the region within days. Military commanders from both sides studied her tactics, trying to understand how a civilian guide had accomplished what trained soldiers could not achieve. Her story became legendary among the mountain communities, inspiring others to take active roles in defending their homes and families. The government offered Maria a commission as an officer in their Special Operations Unit, recognizing her natural leadership abilities and tactical brilliance. However, she declined the offer, explaining that her loyalty was to the people of the mountains rather than to any political cause. She wanted to return to her role as a guide, helping anyone who needed safe passage through the dangerous terrain. The rescued prisoners returned to their families and communities as heroes, but they never forgot the woman who had led them to freedom. Sergeant Lopez remained in contact with Maria, often consulting her about military operations in the mountain region. Many of the former captives credited her with saving not just their lives but their dignity and hope for the future. The captured rebels faced military justice, but Maria's insistence on treating them fairly during their march to captivity had earned her unexpected respect even from her former enemies. Several rebel fighters later testified that her example had convinced them to abandon violent tactics and seek peaceful solutions to their political grievances. The rebel organization never recovered from the loss of their mountain stronghold and key leadership. Without Commander Vasquez and his experienced fighters, the remaining rebels lacked the coordination and resources needed for effective operations. Many rebels surrendered voluntarily, knowing they would receive fair treatment based on Maria's example. Village communities throughout the mountains began organizing their own defense units, inspired by Maria's demonstration that ordinary people could protect themselves when properly organized and led. She occasionally helped train these civilian defenders, teaching them basic tactics and safety procedures without taking sides in the larger political conflict. Years later, when peace finally returned to the region, Maria's story remained an important part of local history and culture. Children grew up hearing about the brave woman who had turned capture into victory and defeat into triumph. Her actions during those crucial days had changed the course of the entire conflict. Maria herself remained modest about her achievements, continuing to work as a mountain guide and helping travelers navigate the peaceful trails that had once been battlefields. She never wrote a book or gave interviews about her experiences, preferring to let others tell her story in their own words. The most lasting impact of Maria's mission was the proof it provided that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Her transformation from captured prisoner to victorious leader demonstrated that heroes could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when people were willing to risk everything for the right cause. When asked about that extraordinary week in the mountains, Maria would simply say that she had done what needed to be done to protect innocent people and bring her fellow prisoners home safely. She insisted that anyone in her position would have made the same choices, though those who knew her story understood that her unique combination of knowledge, courage, and leadership had made the impossible become reality.